Right. So yeah, thank you for coming. My name is Fed. I'm a PhD candidate at UCL, and I will be talking to you about community-led flexibility, which is the topic of my PhD research. I'll actually be talking mostly about the rapid evidence assessment that I've done, which kind of builds the context before community-led flexibility. The agenda is not very detailed, but it's actually very long. We have the three pillars that I study: rapid evidence assessment, and then the next steps. So this is the first section: supply side response, demand side management, and the inequity of demand side management. So I'm part of the futures team, but I'm also part of the equity and flexibility team. And this is how these three pillars come together. So when I refer to the three pillars, I'm talking about these three. So my background before doing my PhD was as a power trading analyst. And so one of the key tasks that we do in this job is looking at the system margins, which is the amount of volume, dispatchable volume available on the grid in order to balance demand and supply. And so the UK power system, like most power systems, is a supply side response system, which means that we have a lot of fossil fuels ready to go in case demand increases, which means that it's great because we have stability, but at the same time, we have high costs because fossil fuels are expensive and they sit there waiting to be called upon. And then there is high emissions. And then obviously there is the paradox of the fact that if we have so much power, we're not incentivized to reduce, which is not great for the environment. But as we move towards net zero targets, we're looking at demand side flexibility or demand side management. So we want to move away from supply side response into a system where we have a fixed amount of renewable power, and then we want to change our demand so that we can, we don't have to resort to this dispatchable power sources. So the advantage is that we reduce cost, lower emissions, but it's very difficult to manage demand side response. So when I talk about the demand side management, there are two sides of the same coin that I think about, and it's demand side flexibility and energy demand reduction. So demand side flexibility is the ability to shift consumption in space and time to change the demand profile, while energy demand reduction is a systematic change in behavior and technology that allows to reduce the overall base load of energy demand. So both of these technologies rely on, both of these management techniques rely on different technological and social requirements. But I think it's quite recognized that there is a lot of equity implications that come, because when we talk about demand side flexibility, they use this battery and solar PV and heat pumps and electric vehicles. There is a clear, an underlying benefit to the people that have more affluent, have extra income to deploy. And at the same time, when you talk about energy demand reduction, there might be some insulations or upgrades in your home that you can do to reduce your consumption that not everybody has access to. So my question is always, the question of my PhD is, how do we look at this equity, flexibility, and energy demand reduction together as we face the energy transition? So when I did my rapid evidence assessment, that's exactly what I looked at. So what are the trade-offs and synergies between these three? And how is equity regarded with respect to the other two? So this is kind of how we can visualize it, three topics, and we're going to go and look at the intersection of each one of these three. So between equity and flexibility. So when we talk about the intersection between equity and flexibility, it revolves around the ideas that we need the technological assets, economic capability, and temporal flexibility. And these three, which is very difficult to get all three at the same time. And this is where we talk about flexibility capital. So flexibility capital is probably a concept that most people are familiar with. And it's the idea that if I can flex my demand, I have an asset that I can optimize and I can use to reduce my energy bill or even make an income in some cases, some very marginal gain. So flexibility capital is either derived through technological assets, PV, solar panels, batteries, all the things I mentioned before, or socially derived. So I can change my behavior so that I can use my dishwasher and laundry at night and be subject to lower energy pricing. At the same time, flexibility capital can also be controlled either by the users themselves or by an external entity that, for example, regulates your consumption, like a utility, for example. So whether we have socially derived or technologically derived flexibility capital, there is actually a lot of challenges that come. And so I just wanted to highlight a few. So in the study by White and Simtov, they were looking at the United States, but there's been many examples in Norway as well, where time of use tariffs that have been implemented in specific regions of the country with the idea of incentivizing people to shift their demand and move consumption to times of the day that had lower demand and lower prices, actually ended up affecting specific groups like elderlies or unemployed people that they didn't have the same level of wealth than someone who might have been a professional, for example, and because they were actually at work throughout those hours of the day might have not been impacted. So there is in this case is an example of socially derived flexibility that didn't work out well. And then there is flexibility work, which is a concept by Fields et al., where they were arguing that when we talk about socially derived flexibility capital, there is a lot of work that goes into planning and changing your routine. And this can be a barrier for people to engage, or can push people away from engaging in the future. From a technological perspective, I'd like to focus on the second example, Crawley 2021, which was a study where they looked at two neighborhoods. The first neighborhood was given a heat pump, but the heat pump was controlled by an external entity based on price signals. And then the second group was actually given smart appliances, and they had control over their own flexibility capabilities. And so what happened is that the heat pump group achieved significantly larger shifts in demand because they had bigger volume than the appliance group. But at the same time, the people that were interviewed after the study said that they felt a sense of discomfort, and because they weren't able to predict whether the heat pumps would have been turned on and off, they felt like it was too stressful compared to the people that were in control of their own appliances and could decide whether they wanted to engage or not. So by looking at this technological and social limitations, one of the solutions that shows up in the literature and has been very successful in Germany, Denmark, but many other countries, is the concept of energy communities. So energy communities are neighborhoods or groups of members that decide to share some of these assets, so solars, batteries, etc., and then also share the flexibility capacity of the system. The reason why they have been particularly successful is that lower income participants get access to these assets that they wouldn't be able to buy otherwise. There is a bigger volume of demand side flexibility because now we have a lot of people that can flex, and demand side flexibility that has been quite granulated, as in the number of people that currently can provide demand side flexibility might be fragmented from a spatial perspective. And so having them grouped all as an energy community can create a larger volume. And so there's also the opportunity to smooth the demand profiles across different participants. So overall, energy communities is a great example of how demand-side flexibility and equity can work together. Some of the limitations have been that some of the members of these energy communities try to achieve energy independence, which means that they don't want to share their own energy stored in batteries or their flexibility with the rest of the grid. And so they have what is called an autarkic behavior. So they don't want to be involved in the rest of the grid, which is inherently wrong, because the reason why energy communities are actually very important in the energy transition is that not only they benefit the members of the energy community itself, but also they reduce energy consumption, but also price for the people outside of the energy community. So the things that we can take away from my literature review, but there is many, but I just wanted to highlight a few, is first of all that energy literacy is it's fundamental when applying demand side response mechanisms and schemes, because there's a lot of people that, despite the ability to have access to these schemes, don't know how to use them, and they might actually be damaged by the fact that maybe they don't understand how time of use tariffs work, for example. Secondly, that social norms should be taken into account more than price signals. Just like in the examples of the heat pumps, we should make sure that everybody can integrate them in the routine rather than trying to maximize profit or savings. And then the last one is that there is we need to prioritize distribution as well, both from a spatial perspective, but also from a distribution across different layers of wealth. Also, feel free to ask me any questions or stop me if there's anything that comes to mind. So let's look at equity and energy demand reduction. So this area revolves around the idea that if citizens living in the global north were able to reduce their energy consumption by 40 to 50%, they would still have a really high standard of life, but they would also contribute towards many of the climate targets. The question, however, becomes, if we asked everyone to reduce their consumption by 50%, some people that are in the, again, most affluent groups, they wouldn't really mind, they wouldn't particularly be impacted, but the people at the bottom would actually be damaged. So both the bullet points on the left and the graphs on the right comes from a study by Bucks et al. They looked at how the distribution of energy consumption in Europe across different groups varies. And what they found is that the top 20% consumes actually a much greater chunk of energy compared to the rest. And if we were able to apply energy demand reduction policies only on the top 20%, we would reduce energy demand by almost 10%. At the same time, they looked at the equity question. What if we wanted to help the bottom 20% and help them consume more without having to incur in all the energy bills and costs that are obviously associated with higher consumptions? So they lowered the consumption in one group and they added a little bit to the other, and they found out that the energy demand reduction that they would have achieved was only 1%. So the question that comes up is a bit of, is there a trade-off between energy demand reduction and energy equity? So I wanted to show an extreme case, this study by San Pedro et al. Carried out in the United States. And they looked exactly at the same scenario. So there is 5 quantiles. So the bottom quantile all the way to the top 20%. And then they had 3 scenarios. So a constant growth, according to the current rate of growth in energy consumption. Then they had an egalitarian scenario, which would allow the people at the bottom to increase their consumption while reducing the consumption at the top. And then they looked at an extreme case scenario, which they called skewed. And what they did is they looked at the distribution of what they claimed to be one of the most inequitable countries in the world. So they looked at South Africa and they said, what if we took the energy consumption distribution in South Africa, where only the top 20% is wealthy enough to consume a lot of energy, and we applied it to the United States. So this is what this graph represents. And so what they found out is that among the 3 cases, the study that actually, the scenario that reduced the energy consumption the most was actually the third one. So a scenario where only the few can consume energy would actually reduce energy consumption. I thought this was a very disappointing result, but I wanted to counterbalance and give a better result. So I'm not going to go through all 3 because I don't think we have the time. But if we look at the last example, which is again Bucks et al., but a different study, 2021, what they did is they looked at different schemes to move away people from car consumption towards public transport. And they looked at 3 possible options: taxing car consumption, then having a tax rebate, or giving vouchers to the people using public transport. And as you can see by the graph, it's quite obvious that the voucher had a much better impact because the financial subsidy provided to the bottom quintiles, to the lower income households, was represented a significant increase with respect to their income, right? And so what it means is that in some cases it's better to promote or support through incentives rather than using taxes. And the reason why taxes don't work is that, as we know, they are regressive, especially in this case, and they don't really incentivize the top 20% to act differently because they just have extra income that they can just use to pay those taxes. The reason why there is 3 examples, technology, behavior, and community structures, is that these were identified as the 3 components to guarantee equity and energy demand reduction at the same time. So if the 3 of them can be coordinated, then there is a positive result. Conclusions, key points to take away, yes, there needs to be a differentiation between energy sufficiency and what I call their luxury energy use. Just the idea that we need to make sure that everybody has the right level of energy whilst also reducing consumption as much as possible. The second point is this concept that technological, behavioral, and community constraints must be worked out together in order to guarantee both reduction and equity. And I just like the carbon vouchers, so I put it as bullet point number 3. Then the last concept is flexibility and energy demand reduction. I've already talked about this, just a reminder. So if we electrify everything, energy consumption will increase significantly. The number I put there is 160% by 2050. So this means that there's going to be we're going to have to overbuild renewable energy, and this is where energy demand reduction and demand side flexibility come into play. So there is 3 key differences between the 2, in my opinion. So there is a difference from a temporal perspective. So demand side flexibility works very well in the short term, but in the long term, we still need structural changes to ensure that energy demand is used in a more efficient way and just optimized so that we can reduce the baseload consumption. Then there is a difference between the value provided to the grid and the value provided to individuals. So, and then there is a difference between optimization and comfort, which I already touched upon. So both demand side flexibility and energy demand reduction have got some social and technical aspects. And the things that I wanted to highlight is that demand side flexibility provides a lot more value to the grid and gives us this flexibility that we've been talking about, while energy demand reduction actually takes away some of the capacity to flex, because if there is less demand, we've got less reduction. The thing that it's important to notice is that both of them will still need grid reinforcements in the future, so we still need to upgrade our grid. And here are the just like key points to take away. Again, the 2 demand side flexibility, energy demand reduction have got different scopes. There is a financial allocation trade-off. So some policies that the government is trying to implement support one, but they're taking away from the other. And then, and then energy demand reduction reduce the need for demand side flexibility, but at the same time, and demand side flexibility has a slightly higher probability to cause inequalities, according to my literature review. So one key aspect that was recurring in my literature review was the fact that energy communities can provide all 3 of these pillars in some sort of balanced way. And so my question has been, if we were to use energy communities as the main source of flexibilities, what would be the impact on the 3 pillars within the community and outside of the community? So my next step of the PhD is to set up this participatory modeling, which will be the core of my research. And there are 2 main concepts that I wanted to discuss today. One is the stakeholders. So it's going to be a participatory modeling because there are so many aspects involved with the energy communities that it would be good no, it would be good, but it would be a lot more accurate to have the input of the stakeholders that are directly involved with the construction and operation of energy communities and the consequences that come with it. So I've put here a list of primary and secondary stakeholders. And then a modeling integration, because I started looking at large scale models that look at the energy power mix of the United Kingdom and their generation, forecast generation over 2050. But they're usually models that work on a large scale, and it's usually they don't have the granularity to define whether specific households or regions are damaged from an equity perspective, or what type of flexibility and demand reduction they can provide. But I still wanted to quantify on a national scale. And then at the same time, there are some smaller models that use these data sets called lower layer super output area, which is almost the granularity of a postcode. And they would be ideal to actually, you can get hourly data points for the consumption, the demand profile of each one of these not households, but postcodes. And so this would be the other option, extremely granular, and you can quantify some of these things. And I was trying to combine the two. So this is pretty much the next step of my research, just like clarifying this step so that I can actually start with the research. So I just wanted to finish by asking if anybody who had previous experience with either the stakeholder engagement or modeling integration, if you're interested to discuss outside of this meeting, or if you have any feedback that you would like to provide, I'll be more than happy to listen. Yeah, I hope I'm not too much over time. This is everything I had.
Great. Brilliant. Thank you, Fed. It was really good, very interesting. So in terms of questions, if people feel free to either raise your hand or put a question for Fed in the chat if you have one at all. Yeah, I can see one from Ren. Ren, do you mind asking a question?
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, really interesting presentation. What it is, when you talk about the customer engagement, what I do notice that recently the market has been pushing more for individual customer engagement on the demand side management. For example, if you look at the latest standard published by Elexon, there's a code called P415, which is a new standard to allow like energy aggregators to be more easier to be integrated with the wholesale electricity market, and then from there they will be able to do the revenue share with the end customer if they participate into that DSR directly, and then there are a whole bunch of other moves or actions taking place at this stage to engage individual customers. So it looks to me that the government's actively, or DESNES, our government is actively pushing to engage more individual customers. Have you take that into account, or do you think that will slightly pivot your future like stakeholder engagement?
So I didn't know about the P415. I think overall energy communities in the UK are significantly smaller in size compared to Germany, Denmark, and many other countries in Europe. I think that the trajectory suggested for the UK is that we will end up around 10%. I really hope that the number is a lot higher. So regarding the individuals engaging in demand-side response, I think that it would be beneficial, maybe I'm wrong, if it was a large-scale system like energy communities rather than individuals, because individuals have a lot of costs associated with all the assets and being able to connect. So I feel like if it was, if we need more people to provide flexibility, it should be done at a scale that it's affordable for everyone.
So yeah, if I go back to your chart showing the like financial incentives versus the capacity, where you show individual customers and the energy communities and the industrial users, is that the aggregate value, or is that just the individual value, like a per entity value?
I'm gonna put it up. Does it work like that?
Yeah, if you go back, there you go, that one, yeah. So is that the kind of like aggregate value for like energy, all the energy communities and all the individual users, or all the industries, or is that actually you're talking about the individual values there?
So first of all, this is it's not to scale, as in this is what I interpreted the literature review to say, that industries are not particularly incentivized to engage, even if they have a lot of volume. Individual users, they have little volume, but they are incentivized to engage. The reason why energy communities have a broader, like a more variable incentive to engage is that because they're not fragmented as much as individuals, there is a higher probability of having someone that it's likely to engage at a given time rather than a specific individual.
Do you think that chart will change as we're electrifying our whole transport and heating, where the individual customers will have a larger energy capacity or energy assets, like for the likes of heat pumps and EV chargers, and then they will do their will they be more incentivized to be engaged with the DSM, or do you think they will have the higher DSM volume available going forward? Yeah, this is just sorry. This is just some just hypothetical questions.
No, that's great. So, I mean, the chart could change. I do have a list of things that I keep an eye for, as in, zonal pricing and all sorts of things that the prices are now, there's been two big.
Because if you look at this chart, if this literature was done like a few years back, and then they will probably assume lots of the heatings are still be done by gas, whereas in the future scenario, if they all move towards heat pump, then we'll have a much higher energy capacity or flexibility that we would be able to do. I mean, for both energy communities and the individual users, you'll see a increase on the DSM volume available going up for both of the segments. But yeah, this is just some
That's a good point.
Right?
I haven't thought about it, but yeah, maybe I should consider it. Thank you.
Yep, thanks.
So we have one question in the chat that I'll sort of read quickly out to Fed, and then we can perhaps move on to Emika. When you consider equity and energy transition here, did you have hypothesis that all price cost on energy bills should be same, so no one is charged more unfairly?
That's in none of my assumptions.
Okay, brilliant. I just have like one sort of really quick question. I was quite interested in your kind of participatory modeling that you're doing, and you're going to be speaking to sort of operators, consumers. I just wonder, just really quickly, how you're thinking of engaging with these communities to bring their insights into the modeling process. I think that's a really, interesting area of research.
So, well, I think there is a lot of overlap with what the Futures team has done. So the Futures team has done a really detailed analysis, which my understanding is that it followed from what CREDS had previously done. And I thought that a lot of the modeling that I wanted to do would have also benefited from the input of people that actually live in this situation, rather than putting parameters based on what I've read in the literature that maybe don't represent how people would actually behave. And so at the moment, I found myself in a situation where I didn't know exactly which stakeholders would have more or less effect towards the decision-making process of how the energy community comes together and how it's managed. And so I just yeah, I just wanted to include as many as possible for the beginning, and then try to understand which ones have a bigger impact on this type of process. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I think for the sake of time, let's move on to Emika now. So Emika, do you mind sharing your screen?
Yeah, give me 1 moment. Okay. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And can people hear me?
Yes, we can see you. We can see and hear you. Okay, yeah.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Emika. I'm a first-year PhD student at the Energy Institute at UCL in the Energy Transitions Modeling Lab. And in my research, I'm interested in looking at the spatial value of demand-side technologies, specifically for low-income households. So to kind of talk about some of the ideas that I've been working on and the research questions I'm hoping to answer and some of the modeling approaches that I'm planning to use, I put this little talk called What's in it for them together, quantifying the locational value of demand-side technology for low-income households. And I'm planning on doing a US-focused analysis just for context. Solar deployment and end-use electrification are crucial to reducing US dependence on fossil fuels. And within electrification, buildings are the end sector that is most predisposed to electrification, at least in the near term. And because I'm really interested in households and residential energy use, this mostly means electrification of heat and cooling, so like deployment of heat pumps. And then residential solar and storage deployment also plays a key role here in providing flexibility and reducing peak demands, as well as increasing distributed generation. And in the last couple of decades, there's been huge growth, particularly in deployment of solar and storage, but also in heat pumps with the investment tax credits and the Inflation Reduction Act incentives, mostly in reducing the upfront cost of those assets to consumers. But particularly in low-income households, there are a lot of barriers to adoption, which creates this changing landscape of DERs with higher levels of asset ownership in higher income homeowning households, which therefore also concentrates the benefits of those assets in those households. And some of the barriers that are most documented include things like the split incentive problem. So that's where landlords aren't incentivized to install solar storage or heat pumps, even if cost effective, because they're not going to benefit from the financial gains to be had from those assets. But then also challenges like rooftop inadequacy and inefficiency in particularly low-income households, as well as challenges in access to financing. And because so many of our incentives are tax credit based, if there isn't sufficient tax burden, as there isn't in many low-income households, that also creates another barrier to adoption. But these technologies can provide a lot of benefits, even in less efficient homes, particularly rooftop solar. There's been a lot of research on how it can reduce many indicators of energy insecurity. So that's behavior like reducing your use of heating and cooling, or defaulting on energy bills, or disconnection from the grid to try to reduce energy bills. And then this is also interesting because there's huge potential for rooftop solar deployment in the US, with 47% of the technical potential for rooftop solar located on low-income households. So this is like a huge market and potential that isn't being accessed because of these barriers, or is having quite a delayed access because of those barriers. And then heat pumps can reduce vulnerability to gas price fluctuations, especially in like gas or propane heated homes. But there's variability in the cost efficacy of that technology. And especially historically, a high coefficient of performance was needed for heat pumps to be cost effective in a lot of US households, which is particularly difficult with older and more poorly insulated buildings to achieve that cost efficacy. And DERs have a very strong locational aspect in terms of the value that they can generate for households. And this is because energy generation and consumption are inherently place-based. And because the US is such a patchwork of grids and markets and pricing structures and also climate conditions, there's huge variability in the amount of benefit that can be realized from adopting these technologies. I think this is really well illustrated by the two maps that I included on the right. So the top one I think is super cool, and it shows where different heating technologies are used across the US. And you can really see this like concentration. It's a little bit small, but you can really see a concentration of natural gas infrastructure in urban areas with more wood and oil and electric heating in more like rural areas. but I think it just shows the spatial variation in heating and household heating across the US. And then the map below shows the residential electricity price by county, which is another layer that affects how cost-effective adoption of this kind of technology is. So again, here there's a huge patchwork in how much you're spending on electricity or how much households are spending on electricity. And so the economic value and decarbonization impact of like storage, solar, and heat pump technologies is greatly affected by these spatially varying factors. Other ones that are important are things like home vintage, like I said, energy price, number capacity, the heating and cooling needs, solar resource, different things like that. And then also like administrative boundaries. So what kinds of incentives and different subsidies are offered by your local government can play a huge role in how cost effective these technologies are. And in addition to this, the grid electricity emissions in the US vary from state to state, as well as in time, which makes when and where new loads or assets like storage and solar are added very important to consider when decarbonization is a goal. And then, so for the technologies that I'll be focusing on, which is heat pumps, solar, and storage, some significant spatial factors include climate conditions, building characteristics, and current heating technology and heat pumps, and then energy prices, solar resource, and the locational value of lost load, or like the value of resiliency, which is also a product of the stability of the grid in different areas for solar and storage. So the questions that I'm interested in exploring in my research are, firstly, where could the deployment of solar storage and or heat pumps provide the greatest financial benefit for low-income communities while also advancing energy system decarbonization? And so this is kind of about identifying places where there are synergies between the highest benefit to deployment of those technologies to low-income households, but also emissions reduction gain from doing so. And then another question I'm interested in is what are the cumulative and future economic impacts of the barriers to DER adoption faced by low-income households, and how might those barriers shape the future landscape of deployment and energy demand? So this is kind of about trying to quantify what the impact of those barriers to adoption will be in different communities over time, and looking into the future, what the benefit could be of removing specific barriers or reducing barriers in different areas. And then another question is how does the deployment of the optimal deployment and potential benefit of DERs differ between core and peripheral energy geographies? So this is something I've been thinking about more recently, and trying to think about how like historical energy injustices and vulnerabilities might affect where DERs in an idealized deployment would be deployed. And then in addition, this is more methodological, but how does spatial granularity of the modeling analysis affect the equity and justice questions that can be answered, particularly relating to locational value and adoption patterns? And so to explore these questions, I'm taking a modeling approach either using or inspired by this model called DGEN, which is maintained and was developed by the National Renewable Energy Lab in the US. The DGEN model is an agent-based model that applies the base diffusion model, which is a technology adoption model that's been used to study the adoption of lots of different technologies beyond just energy system-related technologies. But the major advantages of this model is that it allows for disaggregation both spatially and socially. So it allows for within each county or within each area of study, the disaggregation by income group, renter and owner status, multifamily and single family occupied buildings, which means that for every county, I can look at 20 different agents and therefore like quantify the potential benefit of DER adoption to each of those groups, which is really powerful, especially because it's quite difficult to achieve visibility of different groups within energy system models where things are typically very aggregated. And then another benefit of using this model is that the parameters of the base diffusion model can be adjusted to reflect adoption barriers specific to different groups. And there's been a lot of interesting recent work on trying to calibrate the base diffusion model to different income groups and different geographies based on historic adoption of solar. And so I think that would be something that would be really interesting to explore, especially to try to quantify what the impact to specific groups of barriers to adoption might be over time. And then another element of this modeling approach that I'm hoping to do is a linkage with this capacity expansion model called REES, which is also maintained by NREL. And linkage with this model will hopefully enable me to study the relationship between emissions and burden reduction with the deployment of DERs in specific places, and also to think about the impact of like an idealized adoption or like an idealized DER landscape on peak loads and also capacity expansion. And this analysis is especially enabled by recent data sets that are generated by the ResStock building simulation model. This is a building simulation data set that's supposed to capture like all the buildings in the US, and it has something like 550,000 buildings simulated with like load data. But basically that allows me to allocate or like connect a specific building load profile and building characteristics with each agent in every county. And in addition, there's this data set called Replica, which describes the solar potential of each agent group in every county, and this rate database, which is constantly updated. So those are new data sets that are really exciting and kind of like enable that disaggregation of households and also the spatial disaggregation. So spatial scale is going to be a big part of my research, and it's something that I'm still exploring, especially because with greater spatial granularity comes greater computational need. And so that is going to be potentially a challenge. But right now I'm hoping to do a county level analysis, particularly because of the following two programs. So the Environmental Protection Agency's Solar for All program is $7 billion in funding for low-income solar deployment, which will hopefully begin to be implemented in 2026 and 2027. 2025 was intended for planning, but was hindered because of the situation. But it seems like those funds have been mobilized again. And then also the Weatherization Assistance Program is basically like retrofit program administered through state, territory, and tribal governments in the US, and recently has started to include no-cost solar installation as a part of that program. Its main goal is to reduce energy burden in low-income households, but it started doing this no-cost solar installation and it's had a lot of success in states like California and Colorado, and is looking to expand that program. But both of these programs are implemented at the state level, and so county level analysis of where investment in DERs could be most beneficial for low-income households, or where they could have the greatest aggregate impact on energy burden, is really powerful, especially when states are trying to decide where these funds should be allocated, because that $7 billion has been broken up into states. Now they have these huge funding pots that they need to figure out how to allocate. And county level granularity also creates visibility in places that might have different barriers to adoption or histories of energy injustices. So like I mentioned before, I'm particularly interested in looking at rural versus urban, or kind of what's also described as core versus periphery, which is a little bit more like a nuanced understanding of rural versus urban energy vulnerability. But having greater granularity, especially spatially, allows for better representation and study of inefficient housing stock and reliance on fossil fuels, and what that might mean for like solar storage and heat pump cost efficacy, and where maybe different types of interventions would be needed as opposed to individual adoption of DERs, especially in places that have different vulnerabilities. As well as county level granularity lets you think about where different types of incentives might have a different impact on a system value, system sizing, and then adoption and energy burden in specific income groups or housing groups. And I also just kind of wanted to like locate what the research I'm hoping to do within the energy justice space. So energy justice is typically organized along three tenets: recognitional, so who's affected or who has been affected; procedural, so who's involved in decision making and what processes are involved in decision making; and then distributional, so like where are the benefits and burdens of the energy system distributed. And then this has been broken down further by Sass and Srinivita into time, society, and space pillars, specifically the distributional tenet of energy justice. And since I'm doing this like spatial analysis, I think I'm kind of most aligned with the distributional tenet. And so in time, I'm hoping to quantify the aggregate cost of adoption barriers over time to low-income groups, and then also to contextualize the outputs of this adoption and the potential benefit by considering areas of historical energy injustices, which is a little bit also related to the recognitional pillar. And then across society, I'm hoping to look at how improved representation of potential benefits to different income groups and household types might allow for a better understanding of where investment or incentives could be targeted. And then across space, I'm hoping to gain a better understanding of the spatial distribution of DER value and its interaction with spatial factors of energy burden and like built environment characteristics. And then the 4 equity principles on the right are often discussed in relation to achieving these energy justice goals. So those are equality, capability, responsibility, and cost effectiveness. And this analysis is most focused on the equality. So what a fair distribution of benefits and burdens, or here more specifically benefits of DER deployment would look like, as well as cost effectiveness, which is about like overall utility maximization. So where investment might be the most. And yeah, this kind of goes a little bit more into the weeds of the modeling approach that I'll be taking, but I think maybe in the interest of time and questions, I can leave it if people have specific questions about this model and how it works, we can do that, but I would love to hear other thoughts and questions as well. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emika. That was really interesting. Again, so if there's any questions, please raise your hand or put it in the chat if you'd like to. If not, otherwise I can lead with a question here. So I was quite interested in sort of when you were talking about sort of peripheral energy geographies and thinking about how you could look at this kind of the relationship between historical energy injustices and sort of I might have got this wrong. Could we talked about kind of idealized visions of the future energy system? And I just wonder a bit more about how you think you can kind of, or what you were thinking when you're teasing out the relationship between it, sort of that how past energy injustices might shape how we think about the future energy system.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's definitely something that I'm still exploring. I think it'll most likely look more like kind of contextualizing the outputs of this adoption modeling and trying to understand if it's realistic to deploy these kinds of resources in places that might be more peripheral because there are so many more barriers to adoption. And so that's one way. It might also look like how I can aggregate the results of this analysis. So maybe doing comparison of what kind of benefit could be realized using like deploying solar in specific geographies that are more like peripheral or have experienced historic energy injustices. Because I think like being able to quantify the value of those things and quantify the benefit of those assets is kind of powerful in its own way. But I think it's going to be a lot more on the like contextualization and maybe like scenario side of things than directly into the modeling itself. But yeah, that's something I'm definitely still exploring and trying to wrap my head around in relation to DERs and like individual adoption decisions. It might also be a part of like how I try to represent barriers within the base diffusion model. So if that's like delayed adoption or if it's higher costs of adoption, or like a lower market potential and things like that. But yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So again, just reiterate, if anyone has a question, please do feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, no, thank you for the presentation. So obviously the analysis is very US focused. I just wondered if you thought there was any kind of insights or that could translate into the kind of UK context, or are they so different that actually it's difficult to see that?
Well, I think the principle that energy consumption and generation is inherently very like place bound, and there's variation in locational value is definitely applicable to the UK, and I've seen some really interesting studies specifically about heat pump value distributions in the UK. So I think it could definitely be applied here, and that would also be something to explore that I'd be interested in exploring, because it's such a different climate. I think initially I'd been interested in doing a US focus because of these modeling tools that exist and are like very maintained and like open source and like very ready to use. there, especially trying to do something with a lot of spatial granularity, like reducing that like lift is really helpful. But I think it would be really interesting to also think about in a UK context, especially because there might be more like general momentum politically to like do those things than in the US. So
yeah, I think it would also be really interesting to see if, because it looks very data heavy, and obviously there's very good data in the US, and whether we have the kind of equivalent data sets in the UK, it'd be interesting to get a sense of that from across the EDRC community, and particularly some of the work that's going on up in Leeds in the place-based theme. Would be interesting to find out.
That'd be cool to do a comparison too, maybe, especially in the heat side of things.
Thank you. Perhaps another question around, it's quite interesting, you kind of chosen made clear the kind of county level, and kind of, because if you go quite granular, of course, the computational needs are huge. I just wondered, in terms of higher spatial levels, will you be looking at just the kind of the county level, or will there be some kind of aggregation to think about? Obviously, urban and rural in some parts of the states, the difference are going to be quite more pronounced than in other regions of the United States. I just wondered if there was any sort of, if you're going to be looking at all based on different states, or any other kind of higher levels of spatial aggregation as well.
Yeah, I mean, another level of spatial aggregation I was thinking about was balancing area, because especially if I wanted to look at like network capacity constraints, it would probably be at the balancing area level, which is more, it's like more aggregated than county. Like I think it would be like probably a few counties or something. I don't totally know. Per balance, I think they're like 130. So yeah, it would probably be like a couple per state on average. So that's another one, especially to look at what it might mean for like grid infrastructure. That'd be interesting to look at, or regionally, because the US is also often broken into like climate zones. And so it might be interesting to look at like urban and rural geographies in different climate zones, and how there's different potential for these kinds of assets. Or doing case studies, maybe comparing analyses at a very fine resolution, like a census tract, to an analysis at like a county level, to like aggregating states within a region would be kind of interesting, just like methodologically to think about what kinds of questions can answer different spatial granularity when thinking about benefit, and like what is lost with every aggregation is definitely something I'm thinking a lot about, and not totally sure about what that will be like yet, but on the mind.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, I've got one more question, but if anyone else does have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. If not, I'll ask my question, which was, I was interested, you kind of talked around the solar rooftop scheme and whether the funding and the planning would or would not go ahead based on recent political changes. I just wondered, in terms of the policy mixes being pursued now, and the kind of, are there any other areas in which that's happening that might impact how you're thinking about the modelling and the type of analysis you're going to do?
I mean, the weatherization assistance program, I think, also is kind of facing some potential cuts. I mean, a lot of the reason that so much data is available right now at this kind of granularity is because of the previous administration was really invested in, like, they had the Justice 40 initiative, and they had a lot of like momentum in that space. So that's the reason that there's data like that now. I guess something I've been kind of thinking about is like if that data is going to be maintained or like up to date, and say with like some of these modeling resources, but I'm not totally sure. I know that some like the funding that was mobilized with the Inflation Reduction Act for heat pumps is still available. So yeah, but I think I'll probably be thinking about like the sensitivity of value to different incentives as well. So kind of like playing with that. And so I don't know if it'll be so much like fixed on current policy versus something that you could explore as like a way to change the potential value and then adoption of these resources.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emika. So unless anyone else has any questions, I might say we'll finish there as we're sort of running out of time. Once again, I want to say thank you both to Emika and Fed. It's been really interesting today. I feel like I've learned a lot. So thank you both.
Thank you.